right. Great, thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers. This has been just a spectacular day. I've enjoyed every single talk, and I hope that I can live up to the expectations that have been set by the previous speakers. So I'll be talking about the 25 years of my experience with research on HIV and genocides in Africa. I think I moved to Rwanda in 1986, lived there until 1994, fled in the wake of the genocide to Zambia in southern Africa, set up an HIV project there, and when Rwanda calmed down, we went back to Rwanda and built it up. So that's, in the course of that 25 years, we essentially had to deal with both of these problems. And the title, Sandbox, Etiquette, and When to Take a Swing, sorry, I guess my pointer's not working, but really comes from something that I guess in literature is called the bystander effect, and you may be hearing about it in your generation in relation to bullying. That you can see something going on that's bad, but the tendency, because you're such well-behaved young people, is not to interfere. And I'm saying that in my experience, if there's anything I've learned, it's that there's a point where being nice just doesn't work, and where it's important to step up and overcome your reluctance to engage in conflict and say something. So I'm first going to talk about, ooh, wow. All right, sorry about that. We'll just have to live without the pointer. Maybe I'll just walk over here and swan. This, I'm going to show you some slides that come from this great website, foreignassistance.gov, where you can noodle around and get really a bunch of fantastic information about the U.S. Development budget. So in 2011, our development budget was split into these categories. You see one of the big chunks here was health, the other being peace and security. Humanitarian assistance, economic development down here, a little tiny slice, whoops, for environment. Now, if we go forward with the health portion and blow that up, you can see that really the lion's share has gone for HIV/AIDS. All of these other problems that you'll read down, tuberculosis, malaria, et cetera. I've highlighted water and sanitation and family planning because we're going to come back to that later. So if you take then the slice that goes to HIV/AIDS and you blow that up, what you find is that about half of it, and that's now about $7 billion a year, about half of it goes to 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And they're the 8 countries listed on the right here. All the other countries split that lavender slice, and then the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, who is Ambassador Eric Gooseby in Washington, gets the remaining chunk. So just to summarize the pie charts I've just shown you, 27% of our bilateral foreign assistance is for health. Of that, 64% is for HIV/AIDS, and of that, about half is spent in 8 African countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In those countries, those priority countries, after 8 years and billions of dollars, less than 20% of HIV-positive people have received antiretrovirals, which are the medications that keep people alive when their disease has advanced. And for each patient that we have managed to enroll on antivirals, 2 new infections have occurred. So we've clearly been basically losing that battle, despite, I think, the last year, the people who've been working on HIV have chosen to put a more positive spin on it because they know there's kind of donor fatigue. But the reality is we've been losing ground. And part of it is because of the way that we've chosen to spend the money that has been allocated for HIV. So half of it is spent on treatment and care, only 21% is spent on prevention. And 5% is spent on counseling and testing, which I'll talk about here in a minute as a very important prevention strategy. So you see that actually we've been spending the bulk of the money growing this ever-growing mortgage of people who, once they've started on antiretrovirals, must remain on them for the rest of their lives in an economic climate that simply cannot sustain it, and in countries that have per capita incomes that were never going to be able to entertain this on their own. So in a way, we've sort of brought in a Mercedes to a bicycle environment, and now we're having to maintain the Mercedes. Now, one of the reasons I highlighted family planning is because I wanted you to see that this is the population in Africa. So 1950 is the first time there was any kind of reliable data. There were about 184 million Africans. Since that time, Africa's grown to almost 850 million people. The total fertility rate in Africa is the highest in the world. The average African woman has 5 children. And that is the major driver of poverty. Economic development simply cannot keep pace with the number of new Africans that are born. And the reason that this is happening is not because Africans love to have lots of children and they simply won't listen to advice. It's because there's no contraception available. So contraception costs a lot less than antiretrovirals, but it's not available to African women. And in every study that's been shown, in every program that's been launched, if you make contraceptives available, people will use them. So unfortunately, our government right now is tied up in knots a little bit about this issue, and hopefully we can see our way clear. But just to give some perspective, the population of Africa has grown 64% since the AIDS epidemic was identified in Africa. So despite the ravages of AIDS, the population has continued to grow. The number of people with HIV is about 23 million out of the 850 million, and the number of those that are on antiretrovirals is about 3 million. So 0.35% of Africans are on antiretrovirals, which account for almost 2/3 of our global health budget. And here it is, looking at it from the perspective of those 8 receiving end countries that are getting the bulk of the funding. Here it is, they're getting most of it for HIV/AIDS. Again, very small amounts for family planning, water and sanitation, which I'll talk about in a minute. And all those other things there are getting little tiny slivers compared to the HIV/AIDS pie. I think a lot of people don't realize this because thanks to activists who have managed to gather all of this funding, you have the sense that, oh, we need more, there's so many people in Africa who need drugs, and what no one is really giving is the perspective that we already have a lot, and that arguably we haven't spent it very well. So we should revisit, wouldn't prevention make more sense? So information is really key. 75% of African adults are married. Half of the HIV-positive married adults have HIV-negative spouses, but 95% of them don't know it. So we've actually sponsored, we, the US government, have sponsored 25 million pregnant women to get testing in sub-Saharan Africa, and only a handful of them were tested with their spouses. So it was though these were all immaculate conceptions. And, so I think there's a lot of reasons why this has happened this way, but as someone who was on the front line and witnessed the evolution of all this and screamed loudly the whole time, listen, these are people, families are a unit. Sex requires 2 people. If we could get everybody to have sex with themselves, we would not have an epidemic. But that turns out to be not like a really strong sales pitch. And so, at minimum, 2 people are involved, and you need to have both of them in the room together, discussing what their test results are, what the plans are, and you're talking about cities where 20% of the married couples have one HIV positive and one HIV negative partner. So this is really critical, but it's not happening. So we've put together a prevention package that tackles HIV, unplanned pregnancy, and other common causes of death. So we know from our experience with testing some 150,000 couples now in Africa that new infections are reduced by 2/3 just by telling them their respective test results and helping them make a plan. If we combine that HIV counseling with family planning, we reduce unplanned pregnancies by 50%. Very cheap. If we add a basic package of health services that cost about $2, we can also tackle pneumonia, diarrhea, and parasitic infections, including malaria, that kill more people than HIV. In comparison, antiretroviral treatment costs about $400 per year per person. So here's, I'm going to show you some photographs of our couples testing program. Ubumi Bwesu is one of the languages we work in. Bemba, it means it's your life. And couples come in together, they talk with the counselor, they have their blood drawn. Rapid HIV tests are done, which are a bit like rapid pregnancy tests that you can buy at the pharmacy. Down here in the corner is also syphilis testing, which is very simple and easy. It costs about 25 cents to test for syphilis, about $1.25 to cure it with 1 injection. There's no resistance to penicillin. It only costs about $1 for each of the HIV tests. So I'll describe to you a slightly out of the sandbox moment with respect to syphilis. When we had started training counselors in some of the clinics that we were working in, government clinics, to do both HIV and syphilis screening, along came this $100 million program to prevent transmission of HIV from mother to child. So we were sort of ushered out of the clinics, thank you, you've done your bit, we're going to take over now. And we said, great, now we've trained them to do these 2 tests, and the HIV people said, hey, syphilis, not our issue. And we said, but there's a lot of syphilis here. 15% of the women have positive syphilis tests, and syphilis kills babies and women too, and it's really cheap and easy, and we've already trained everybody, it really wouldn't cost you anything. And they said, no, it's not our issue. And so I said, this sounds a lot to me like Tuskegee, and I'll betcha my friend at the New York Times will agree. And wham, we had syphilis testing. Okay, so... So, I'm not saying throw the first punch, but I am saying get ready to stand your ground, because it's the right thing. When you know it's the right thing, you gotta persist. So for our couples, we also offer childcare, because one of the big obstacles for, of course, a husband and wife to come in together is who will take care of the children. And that's provided me many, many, many years of enjoyment watching these children as their parents are getting counseled. So the 2 countries that we've worked in are Rwanda, where I lived from 86 to 94, and then Zambia, where we fled after the genocide. Those red countries are the countries where the US government, the priority countries that I spoke about earlier. So from a research standpoint, it turns out to be really useful to study these 2 countries and to compare them. They have different viruses. The people who live there have different genetic makeup. We've been able to work towards understanding that and perhaps developing a vaccine by looking at viruses that are transmitted from men to women, from women to men. So there has been a really scientific side to this in addition to the behavioral components. But the genocide in Rwanda was certainly life-changing moment. And I can tell you that 1994 for me, I had just had my first son, Ryan, who's here. And I was pregnant with my second son, Kieran, who, thank God, will be an Emory freshman in the fall. And so we had to flee, we the expatriates. Everybody had to leave. We relocated to Zambia. But of the 70 people that I had worked with side by side for 8 years in our HIV project, half died or disappeared. And I heard many of the stories of exactly how they died from others who were there when it happened. And I can tell you there's nothing that puts a fire in your belly like hearing firsthand the story of how someone you loved was hacked to death or thrown into a pit with gasoline and lit on fire. So these things happened, and they happened to people that I loved. And I became very intolerant of the apathy that had surrounded the buildup to the genocide, which was organized, and which has basically characterized our government's response to what's happened since. So the July, many of you, of course, were Ryan's age, so you weren't even born or you were just toddlers. It happened between April and July 1994. It was organized by the government of the then government of Rwanda with military, paramilitary, civil service, religious, and community participation. 1 million people were killed in 100 days. That's actually a higher density than in the Holocaust. Mostly the ethnic group Tutsi and the moderate Hutu who did not support the genocide ideology. So if you were not a part of the power that was killing, then you risked being killed. Now the genocide was actually stopped by rebel forces who were the children of people who had fled previous genocides in Rwanda and were living in surrounding countries, and they now control the government. So since July of 1994, the government's been controlled by the people who stopped the genocide, and they've done a spectacular job of running the place. This is the memorial for our project. Every year we have an anniversary where we commemorate the people that we have lost. Now, what the US government did in the wake of the genocide was to try to help Rwanda with a justice system, and they used something similar to what we used after the Second World War, which sort of graded perpetrators based on how many deaths they were responsible for. So at the top, you could see like the 7 masterminds, each controlled 10 people, so that's 70 people, who then controlled 10 people and so forth. The rank and file, who are on the front lines with machetes, about 700,000 people is the estimate. Meanwhile, over here, there's an inverse relationship between how high you are on that totem pole and how many deaths you can be alleged to be responsible for. So these 7 people at the top are each responsible for 100,000 deaths and so forth. In a simplistic kind of way, but it helps you sort of grade how severe somebody's participation was in the crime. Now, if you decided that you were just going to go from here on up, okay, this 7,000 on up, each one responsible for killing 100 people. And that was enough people that you really wanted to take action against them. I can tell you there are several dozen of them living in the United States. And they are not hiding. I find them Googling using their real names. They have Facebook pages. And since 1997, our government has only arrested 4 of them and deported them. So this was the initial attempt by the International Criminal Tribunal to bring perpetrators to justice. They spent about $1.5 billion on less than 40 prosecutions, and then they were defunded. Not surprisingly. This gentleman here was one of the first 3 to ever be handed over, to the ICTR, and he was actually the result of an investigation in Zambia. So when we fled Rwanda to Zambia, a whole bunch of genocide perpetrators also fled there. They heard our peppy announcements on the radio, come get tested for HIV with your spouse, realized that we were the same people that came from Rwanda, didn't want us in Zambia because they thought we might blow their cover, and threatened to kill us. So we went to the Zambian authorities and we explained, and we got a bunch of the embassies on board. I'm both Irish and American, so the Irish embassy has a presence in Zambia, very active. And this guy was one of the first 3 to be handed over to the ICTR by the government of Zambia and was convicted. Now you notice how chummy he is with his erudite and very expensive lawyers. That's unfortunately what characterized that failed process. Now we are left with Immigration and Customs Enforcement to deal with the people that are here in the United States. This is their webpage for the Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Unit. They say since 2004 they've arrested 200 people, yada yada. They're now pursuing 1,900 leads for human rights violators from nearly 95 different countries. So, you know, it's not a mystery who you're supposed to go to, and I've talked with these folks many, many times in the last 18 years. Them, Department of Justice, Department of State, their equivalents in Ireland and Britain, everyone in Zambia who, you know, hey, you guys were you were the first country to arrest Rwandan war criminals, please do more of it. But our main focus now is getting the ones who are here in the United States, because I mean, I just don't understand. So especially since Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the umbrella under which human rights violators operates, deports 700,000 people a year or more from the US. Most had not even had a traffic ticket. I mean, these are people who are just ejected. And I don't know if anyone's ever had ICE knocking on your door, but it happened to our daughter when we were on a cruise once and there was a mix-up about her passport. They treated her like a criminal. If they would just once treat a Rwandan the way they treated our daughter, I'd be happy. But the fact is, my question to them now is, look, you deport 700,000 people a year. You say you're investigating 1,900 alleged human rights violators. Why can't that 1,900 and all the Rwandan genocide planners, some of whom, you know, have not been on the list, be part of this year's 700,000? I mean, that just doesn't seem like rocket science to me. So, in summary, our handling of HIV and genocide in Africa really leaves a lot to be desired as a country. We can do better, and we owe it to the survivors to do better. So it's up to your generation to be loud. Don't stay in that sandbox. Step up and say, we have to do something. And this is greetings from Rwanda. These ladies have been a part of our project for 25 years now, and they are celebrating. Thank you. So, should I sit down?